My sister betrayed me and married my millionaire fiancé. 7 years later, she bragged, she had it all. I smiled back. Have you met my husband yet? People assume the worst betrayal comes from strangers. They're wrong. The deepest wounds usually come from the people who already know exactly where to aim. In my case, it was my own sister. Growing up, Claire and I couldn't have been more different. She loved attention. I avoided it. She could walk into a room and somehow become the center of every conversation within minutes. I preferred sitting in the corner with a book. Our parents always described us as opposites who balanced each other. Looking back, I don't think we balanced anything. I spent most of my childhood quietly giving up things to keep Claire happy. If we both wanted the same birthday gift, somehow she got it. If we argued, I was expected to apologize because I was the mature one. If Claire made a mistake, everyone blamed her impulsive personality. If I made one, I should have known better. By the time we reached adulthood, I had accepted a role I never chose. The accommodating sister. The reliable daughter. The one who could always understand. Then I met Daniel. He wasn't flashy despite being incredibly successful. By 32, he'd already built and sold 2 software companies. Money had never changed him. He still drove the same modest SUV. Still volunteered at the children's hospital every month. Still remembered the names of waiters we'd met only once. That kindness was what made me fall in love with him. After 2 years together, he proposed. It wasn't extravagant. Just a quiet evening overlooking the lake where we'd had our first date. I said yes before he even finished asking. For the first time in my life, something felt entirely mine. Wedding planning began almost immediately. Claire offered to help with everything. Dress shopping, venue visits, cake tastings. She insisted she wanted my wedding to be perfect. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my sister. Then little things started feeling strange. She suddenly became unusually interested in Daniel's work schedule. She always volunteered to pick up documents from his office if I was busy. Whenever we all had dinner together, she somehow managed to sit beside him. I noticed. Then convinced myself I was imagining it. After all, who suspects their own sister? 3 months before the wedding, Daniel started acting differently. He seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone, canceling dinners because of unexpected meetings. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he smiled and blamed work. I wanted to believe him. Love has a remarkable way of making obvious things invisible. The truth arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had forgotten my laptop at Daniel's apartment and used the spare key he'd given me months earlier. The apartment was unusually quiet. I called his name. No answer. Then I heard laughter coming from the bedroom upstairs. For one irrational second, I actually smiled. I thought Claire must have stopped by to help him plan another surprise for me. I opened the bedroom door without knocking. The image burned itself into my memory forever. Daniel and Claire, standing together in the middle of the room. Neither of them had enough time to pretend. Nobody spoke, nobody had to. Every explanation disappeared the moment our eyes met. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember driving home. The next few days exist only as scattered memories. Crying in the shower. Ignoring phone calls. Staring at my engagement ring for hours before finally placing it in a small envelope addressed to Daniel. A week later, Claire came to my apartment. Not to apologize. To explain. According to her, love wasn't something people could control. She insisted she hadn't planned for any of this to happen. She claimed feelings had simply developed. Then she asked for my understanding. As though betrayal became less painful if described politely. I quietly wished them happiness. Closed the door, and cried harder than I ever had in my life. 6 months later, they got married. Many of the wedding guests had originally been invited to mine. Some relatives told me I should attend to prove I was the bigger person. I didn't. Instead, I accepted a job offer in another city, packed everything I owned into a rented truck, and disappeared from the life I'd spent years building. I told myself I wasn't running away, I was starting over. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. I had no idea that 7 years later, one unexpected family reunion would change everything. Those 7 years changed me in ways I never expected. The first year was the hardest. I threw myself into work because it was easier than sitting alone with my thoughts. I accepted every project, worked weekends, volunteered for business trips, anything that kept me moving. Slowly, the pain became quieter, not because I forgot, because I finally stopped asking myself what I could have done differently. The answer was always the same. Nothing. Someone else's betrayal is never your responsibility. My career flourished. The company I joined was expanding rapidly, and within 4 years I was leading an entire regional division. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in anyone's shadow. Ironically, losing the wedding I dreamed of led me to a life I never would have found otherwise. I rarely spoke to my family. Not because I hated them, because every phone call somehow found its way back to Claire. Mom constantly reminded me that family is family. Dad insisted enough time had passed for everyone to move on. Move on. Those words always made me smile. It's easy to ask someone else to move on when you weren't the one left standing in a wedding dress that never got worn. Eventually, they stopped asking. Then one autumn afternoon, an invitation arrived. My grandmother was turning 80. The entire family would be there. She specifically requested that I come. Unlike everyone else, Grandma had never defended Claire. She'd simply hugged me after everything happened and whispered, "One day, you'll understand that losing the wrong person is sometimes life's greatest gift." I hadn't believed her then. 7 years later, I decided to attend. The celebration was held at an upscale country club. As soon as I walked inside, I felt dozens of eyes land on me. Some relatives looked genuinely happy to see me. Others looked curious, as if they were waiting to compare my life to Claire's. It didn't take long to find her. She looked exactly how social media had suggested. Designer dress, diamond jewelry, luxury handbag. Daniel stood beside her wearing an expensive tailored suit. From a distance, they looked like the perfect couple. Claire spotted me almost immediately. A smile spread across her face. Not a warm smile. A victorious one. She crossed the room with the confidence of someone convinced she'd won years ago. She hugged me before I had time to react. Then spent the next several minutes casually mentioning their vacation home in Aspen. Their beach house in Florida. Daniel's newest investment. His latest luxury car. Every sentence sounded less like conversation, and more like a performance. Several relatives gathered around us, exactly as she'd intended. Finally, she tilted her head and gave me a sympathetic smile. She said she'd heard I was still focused on my career. She hoped I'd eventually find someone because everyone deserved happiness. The words sounded kind. The tone wasn't. She wanted everyone listening to believe she'd gotten the fairy tale ending. I simply smiled. I congratulated her. Told her I was genuinely glad life had worked out. That seemed to confuse her. She had expected bitterness. Instead, she got peace. She wasn't ready to give up. A few minutes later, she proudly announced that marrying Daniel had been the best decision of her life. She said some people are simply meant for success. Then she looked directly at me. The room became noticeably quieter. Everyone could sense the old story resurfacing. I smiled politely. Took a sip of my drink. Then asked the simplest question imaginable. "That's wonderful." I paused just long enough for everyone to look at me. Then added, "By the way, have you met my husband yet?" The smile disappeared from Claire's face. Because she hadn't even known. I'd gotten married. The room went completely silent. Not because I'd raised my voice. Because nobody in my family knew there was a husband. I'd kept my private life exactly where it belonged. Private. Claire blinked several times before forcing another smile. She asked when it had happened. I calmly explained that we'd been married for almost 3 years. A few relatives gasped. Even my parents looked shocked. Mom admitted she hadn't known. I simply reminded her that we hadn't exactly been speaking very often. That answer landed harder than I intended. Before anyone could ask another question, someone entered the ballroom behind me, tall, well-dressed, confident without trying to appear impressive. He walked directly toward me. Then kissed my forehead before asking if I was ready to head home whenever I wanted. That was my husband. Ethan. Claire's expression immediately changed. Not because of how he looked. Because she recognized his name. Years earlier, Daniel had spoken about one competitor more than anyone else. A businessman whose company kept winning contracts Daniel desperately wanted. Someone who had quietly built one of the fastest-growing technology firms in the country. That man was Ethan. Ironically, we'd met at a leadership conference. Neither of us knew anything about each other's past. To him, I was simply another executive giving a presentation. To me, he was an intelligent stranger who asked thoughtful questions instead of trying to impress everyone in the room. Our friendship grew slowly. Then naturally, for the first time in my life, I experienced a relationship that never felt like a competition. He celebrated my promotions, asked about my goals, encouraged me to become more ambitious instead of less. He never once made me feel like I had to shrink so someone else could feel taller. As relatives introduced themselves, Ethan greeted everyone politely. No arrogance, No expensive watch flashed across the room. No stories about private jets or vacation homes. Just genuine kindness, oddly enough, that seemed to make Claire even more uncomfortable. Then my uncle asked the obvious question. "So what do you do?" Ethan smiled modestly and mentioned the company he'd founded. The reaction was immediate. Several cousins recognized the name. One even admitted he'd invested in the business years earlier. Another congratulated Ethan on recently appearing in a national business magazine. Claire looked toward Daniel. Daniel had gone unusually quiet. For years, he'd measured success by comparing himself to everyone around him. Unfortunately for him, he knew exactly how successful Ethan had become. The conversation shifted naturally toward business. Someone mentioned Ethan's company had recently acquired 2 international firms. Another relative recalled reading that the acquisition had been worth hundreds of millions. I noticed Daniel staring into his drink. He hadn't contributed a single word for nearly 10 minutes. Then came the moment I never expected. My grandmother slowly stood up. She smiled at Ethan, then looked around the room. "I've been watching something interesting all evening." Everyone turned toward her. She continued calmly. 7 years ago, everyone whispered about who lost the millionaire. She looked directly at Claire. "Tonight, nobody's talking about money." She turned toward me. "They're talking about who found peace." No one argued, because everyone could see it. Claire had spent the entire evening trying to prove she'd won. I hadn't been trying to prove anything. That difference was impossible to hide. As dinner continued, Ethan quietly squeezed my hand beneath the table. He had no idea what my grandmother's words meant. Not yet. He simply smiled because he thought it had been a sweet family moment. I smiled back. For the first time in 7 years, I realized something. This wasn't about showing Claire that I'd married someone wealthier. It was about watching her slowly understand. She had never taken the best thing from my life. She had only taken the person who was willing to betray me. And there was a very big difference. The party ended a little earlier than expected. Not because anyone argued, because the atmosphere had completely changed. 7 years earlier, everyone had looked at Claire and Daniel as the couple who had won. Now, people weren't impressed by designer clothes or luxury vacations. They were quietly comparing something far more difficult to fake: contentment. As Ethan and I walked toward the parking lot, my grandmother caught up with us. She hugged my husband, then hugged me a little tighter. Before letting go, she whispered something I'd never forget. "I prayed that one day you'd stop wondering why this happened." She smiled. "I think today you finally did." She was right. For years, I'd secretly wondered why I had lost everything. Standing there beside my husband, I realized I never had. A few weeks after the reunion, my mother called. Not to defend Claire. Not to ask me to forgive anyone. She admitted that watching both daughters together had forced her to confront something she'd ignored for years. She confessed that after my engagement fell apart, she'd focused on repairing Claire's reputation instead of helping me heal. It was easier to pretend the family wasn't broken than to admit who had broken it. For the first time, she apologized without asking me to move on. That mattered. My father reached out a few days later. He admitted something that surprised me. He'd spent years convincing himself that Claire and Daniel's marriage proved everything had worked out for the best. The reunion shattered that illusion, because he'd watched Claire spend an entire evening trying to convince everyone she was happy. People who are truly happy rarely need an audience. Meanwhile, I'd never once mentioned Ethan's success until someone asked. That difference spoke louder than anything else. Several months passed before I heard from Claire. She asked if we could meet for coffee. Curiosity won. When I arrived, she looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. The confident woman from the reunion was gone. She admitted that marrying Daniel hadn't been the fairy tale everyone imagined. His business had become his entire identity. He measured friendships by status, vacations by price, people by what they could offer him. She confessed that somewhere along the way, they had stopped being partners and started becoming competitors. Every promotion became a comparison. Every purchase became a contest. Every achievement had to be bigger than the last. She quietly admitted something I never expected to hear. The man I stole was never the man I thought he was. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. Mostly, I felt sad. Because she'd sacrificed a sister for a life that never actually existed. Before we left, she asked the question she'd clearly been carrying since the reunion. "Were you trying to make me jealous when you asked if I'd met your husband?" I smiled, then shook my head. No. I was reminding myself how far I'd come. That was the truth. The question had never been about Ethan. It had been about me. About realizing I no longer needed my sister's approval, my family's validation, or the life I'd imagined with Daniel. A year later, Ethan and I welcomed our first child. At the hospital, while holding our daughter for the first time, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and quietly said he hoped she would always know exactly how much she was loved. No comparisons, no favorites, no competition, just love. In that moment, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. The greatest revenge isn't becoming richer than the people who hurt you. It isn't marrying someone more successful. It isn't watching them regret their choices. The greatest revenge is building a life so full of peace that their betrayal no longer defines your story. 7 years earlier, my sister thought she'd stolen my future when she married my millionaire fiancé. She was wrong. She only removed the wrong man from my life. That made room for the right one to walk in. And looking back, I don't remember the engagement I lost. I remember the family, the marriage, and the life I almost missed because I thought losing him meant losing everything. It never did. It was simply the beginning of something far better. Thanks for reading.